I knew Greg was lying when he started smiling during phone calls. Pilots don't smile that much at work. They talk about fuel loads and turbulence and arrival slots, not grin-worthy material. But Greg had that new brand of happiness, the fake, manufactured kind, like a photo filter pasted over exhaustion. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. He'd come home from his flights, smelling faintly of hotel soap and fresh citrus cologne, not the brand I'd given him last Christmas, but something brighter, more expensive, and, dare I say, romantic. When I asked if the airline had changed their toiletries, he blinked twice before answering. That's how I knew. Greg always blinked too much when his brain scrambled for something believable. Yeah, he'd said, setting his suitcase in the hall. They switched vendors. You know airlines, always changing things. Of course, I said. Wouldn't want the passengers to complain about subpar shampoo. He laughed too quickly. I smiled back, the kind of smile that made my cheeks ache. It wasn't the first time he'd tried to charm his way through a lie, but it was the first time I noticed the effort it took. The truth was, I had seen this coming months earlier. Small signs, the kind most women ignore because acknowledging them means facing the possibility that the life you built sits on borrowed time. Late-night texts from crew buddies, whispered phone calls from hotel balconies, and his sudden obsession with fitness. A man doesn't start training for marathons at 45 unless he's running from something, or toward someone. At the real estate office, gossip was our local currency. If you wanted to know which neighbor was renovating secretly, or whose marriage cracked beneath its granite countertop, you went to Helen Waverley. She'd tell you before the wallpaper glue dried. So when Helen leaned over my desk one Tuesday and said, "I saw Greg at the Green Bean Cafe yesterday, looking mighty cozy with that yoga instructor," I didn't even flinch. "Really?" I asked, pretending to scroll through listings. "Which one?" "The tall one, long ponytail, cute in that self-serious way, the one who always posts about inner balance but parks diagonally." I smiled. Balance isn't her strong suit then. Helen laughed, satisfied with her own detective work. She didn't realize she'd just handed me the confirmation I'd been avoiding. That night, when Greg came home later than usual, I poured 2 glasses of wine and waited. I watched him unpack his flight bag. Uniform shirt perfectly folded, tie draped like a medal. He looked like the man every woman in this neighborhood wanted to marry 15 years ago. Steady, responsible, capable. The kind of man who mowed the lawn on Sundays and remembered the Wi-Fi password. "Rough day?" I asked. "Long flight," he said, loosening his collar. "Weather delays." Of course, the weather, the eternal scapegoat. I nodded sympathetically. "I ran into Helen today. She said she saw you." His hand froze mid-motion. "Oh." "At the cafe," I added, my tone light. "You didn't tell me you liked almond milk lattes." He blinked, twice. "Just grabbed one before heading to the airport. Quick stop." "Sure," I said, raising my glass. "To quick stops." He clinked reluctantly, his eyes searching mine for signs of suspicion. He didn't find any. I'd learned long ago that anger makes men defensive, calm makes them confess eventually. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling of pretense. His phone started living face down on the counter. He showered before saying hello. He started humming unfamiliar tunes in the kitchen, songs that didn't belong to our playlist. I didn't confront him. I watched, waiting, cataloguing every inconsistency like a forensic accountant of emotions. My friends would have told me to demand answers, but that would have given him control of the narrative. Instead, I smiled, hosted open houses, and let him believe I was too busy to care. Until one Saturday afternoon when everything tipped. I'd just finished showing a 5-bedroom colonial to a couple with matching poodles when I got home and found Greg's car in the driveway. He was supposed to be on a layover in Chicago. Inside, The house smelled like fabric softener and panic. The closet doors were open, drawers half empty. Greg stood by the bed, folding shirts. "Packing light?" I asked, setting my purse down. He startled slightly, then smiled, again, that strained pilot grin. "Hey, you're home early." "Open houses don't last forever," I said. "Going somewhere?" Before he could answer, a voice floated from the hallway. "Dad, are we ready yet?" It was Elliot, his son from his first marriage. 17, all attitude and overpriced sneakers. He strolled in, phone in hand, smirk already loaded. When he saw me, his eyebrows lifted. "Oh, hi, Vanessa." "Elliot." He looked at Greg, then back at me. "Dad's going to stay with Mom for a while," he said, tone soaked in teenage arrogance. "It's not cheating if you know." Greg muttered, "Elliot, enough." But the damage was done. The air felt thick, not from shock but clarity. The kind that settles after denial finally leaves the room. I smiled. A real one this time. "Of course. Why should it be cheating? It's just logistics." Greg's mouth opened to speak, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned, walked calmly into my office, and closed the door. My fingers didn't shake as I pulled out my phone and called Leonard, my lawyer. "Vanessa," he answered, cheerful as ever. "Hi, Leonard. I need to make some immediate adjustments to my accounts. Personal or business?" "Both." The next day moved like a checklist. Bank, firm, paperwork. I'd spent years helping other people manage property. It was time to manage my own. By noon, our joint funds were frozen. By 3, I'd transferred ownership of the lake cabin to my name through an obscure clause Greg never read. He'd skimmed our contracts the same way he skimmed emotional conversations, carelessly. At home, I packed quietly. Every item went into boxes labeled with precision. I didn't cry, didn't yell. I just organized. That's what real estate agents do when their lives implode. They stage the wreckage. Around 6, Helen appeared at the door with a casserole and concern disguised as curiosity. "I heard Greg's leaving." "You heard correctly," I said, taking the dish. "Chicken and rice?" "Of course. Comfort food." She peered past me, scanning the half-empty shelves. "You handling it okay?" "Better than he will," I said, and shut the door gently. That night, Greg called 15 times. I watched the phone buzz on the counter, silent. On the 16th ring, I answered. "Vanessa, what did you do?" His voice cracked between anger and disbelief. "Handled logistics," I said. "You know I'm thorough." "All our accounts." "Not ours anymore," I corrected. "Check the names carefully. You'll find the paperwork quite educational. You can't just—" "I can," I said evenly. And I did. He went quiet for a long time. Then, softer, "You're really leaving?" "Technically, you left first. I'm just catching up." He started another sentence, stopped, then hung up. I stood there for a moment, staring at the quiet screen, and realized I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a kind of clean stillness. The next morning, I drove to the new apartment I'd rented downtown. Smaller, yes, but mine entirely. The realtor looked surprised to see me as the client for once. "Starting over?" she asked, half smile on her lips. "Something like that," I said. By noon, movers carried in the last of my boxes. I set up my desk by the window overlooking the street. The air smelled like paint and independence. When my phone buzzed again, I ignored it. Later, I glanced at the screen. 10 missed calls from Greg. 3 from an unknown number, probably Lydia's. I pictured them pacing in whatever temporary place they'd chosen, realizing too late that charm doesn't pay bills. That evening, Helen texted. "Saw Greg at the bank today. He looked like he swallowed a lemon." "You okay, dear?" "Better than the lemon," I replied. I sat by the window as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the neighborhood lights flickering on one by one. For years, I'd thought of the street as safety, a row of perfect homes protecting us from chaos. Now I saw them for what they were, facades, each one hiding its own secret inventory of resentment and regret. And me, I wasn't the victim in this story. I was just late realizing I'd been written into the wrong chapter. By midnight, my phone buzzed again. A message from Greg. "We need to talk, please." I typed slowly. "You should talk to your accountant instead." Then I put the phone face down and turned off the lamp. For the first time in months, I slept easily. No tossing, no imagining flight schedules or hotel rooms. Just silence and the soft hum of the city outside, like a new beginning hiding inside the noise. When morning came, I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the one Greg always hated because it said, "She who handles it." I smiled at the irony. The phone buzzed again. I didn't check it. I had showings to prepare, clients to meet, and a life to rebuild brick by brick. Somewhere out there, Greg was discovering how fragile comfort becomes when the woman holding it together decides to stop pretending. And I intended to make sure he remembered exactly who had taught him that lesson. By noon, the first rumor had already spread across Maplewood Estates that I'd drained our savings, sold the cabin, and vanished into thin air. Helen texted another update. "People are saying you ran off with a client. I told them you'd never mix business with pleasure." "Thanks for the faith," I replied. She added a winking emoji, followed by, "Though if you did, I'd still cheer for you." I laughed out loud. Gossip traveled faster than any plane Greg ever flew, and this time, I was the turbulence. That afternoon, I took a drive through the old neighborhood, purely out of curiosity. Greg's car wasn't in the driveway, but the curtains were open. The house looked smaller somehow, like a stage set after the actors left. I parked down the street and watched for a minute, then whispered to myself, "Sold." It felt right. The phone rang again as I drove away. I let it ring until it stopped. He could call 100 times if he wanted. I'd answer when it suited me. Maybe on the 100th and 1st. Maybe never. For now, I had peace to enjoy and plans to perfect. And the first of them was simple. Never let another smile fool me again. When you freeze someone's accounts, the silence that follows isn't peaceful, it's strategic. Like the quiet between thunder and lightning. You know something's coming. You just get to decide how ready you'll be when it hits. Greg hadn't called since that night, but I imagined him pacing in his hotel room, trying to remember where his paychecks actually landed and why the joint account suddenly showed a flat line of zeros. The truth was, I'd been preparing this moment longer than I'd admitted, even to myself. All those years of organizing contracts and title deeds for clients had trained me to see ownership for what it really was, a matter of paperwork and precision. Love, unfortunately, didn't require either. The next morning, I met Leonard at the cafe down the street from my office. He'd been my attorney for a decade, the kind of man who always wore the same grey suit and smelled faintly of leather briefcases. "You sure you want to move this fast?" he asked, stirring his coffee. "I don't believe in slow-motion crises," I said. "And I don't plan on leaving any loose ends." He nodded. "You've already transferred the cabin?" "Signed and filed." He never read the co-ownership clause I added last year, too busy polishing his pilot wings. Leonard chuckled. "You always did know your fine print." That was the compliment I wanted. I didn't need pity or validation, just acknowledgement that I was in control. Back at the office, the phones buzzed non-stop. Real estate in Maplewood never slept, especially when drama fueled its listings. My assistant, Kelly, leaned over my desk, whispering like we were in a confessional. "So I heard Greg moved out." "Word travels," I said, flipping through a file. "It's all over the neighborhood board. Someone posted about seeing a moving truck." "That would be me moving out," I corrected, keeping my tone calm. "But don't tell them. Let them enjoy the guessing." Kelly grinned. "You're handling this way better than I would. I'd probably throw his suits into the yard." "I prefer financial fireworks to fabric ones." That line became my personal mantra. Every call I made that week had a purpose. Bank managers, investment advisors, property registrars. By Friday, every joint asset we had was either split or frozen. Greg's signature wasn't needed because I'd planned years ahead. He thought our marriage was routine. I thought of it as a contract that required occasional updates. The first sign that he'd noticed came that evening. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter while I was chopping vegetables. His name lit up the screen, Greg H. I ignored the first call, the second. By the third, curiosity won. "Vanessa," he said, his voice rough, "what's going on with our accounts?" "Our accounts," I repeated, sliding the knife neatly along the cutting board. "That's an outdated term. This isn't funny." "I wasn't aiming for comedy. Try looking at your email. There's a document from Leonard's office. Very thorough reading for a pilot." He paused. "You can't just take everything." "Technically, I didn't take anything. I secured my share. You spent years taking liberties. I'm taking precision." He exhaled sharply. "You're being unreasonable." "Reasonable is what got us here," I said, then hung up before he could continue. I'd learned something interesting during those long years of pretending not to notice his habits. The most powerful response isn't anger, it's administrative efficiency. The next morning, Helen appeared again, pretending to check her mail, but clearly waiting for me to step outside. She waved cheerfully. "Morning, Vanessa. I ran into Greg at the bank yesterday." Poor thing looked lost. "I imagine he was," I said. "New financial landscapes can be confusing." She tilted her head, her pearl earrings catching the sun. "People are talking, you know. Not that I listen, but they're saying you froze him out completely." "I didn't freeze him out," I said, smiling. "I just cooled things to room temperature." Helen grinned, delighted. "You always did have a way with words. Between you and me, half this street is rooting for you." "Half? The other half is terrified of you, which means you're doing something right." When she left, I stood there for a moment, looking down the street, lined with symmetrical lawns and trimmed hedges. From the outside, Maplewood Estates looked serene, but it was really an ecosystem of secrets. Everyone here lived in glass houses and threw pebbles for sport. That afternoon, I received a text from an unknown number. "You're going to regret this." No signature, but the arrogance practically signed itself. I typed back, "Then I'll add it to the list of regrets you gave me." No reply came. By the third day, Greg's tone shifted from anger to pleading. He called from different numbers, left voicemails alternating between charm and fury. I saved each one in a folder labeled Exhibit A. Leonard said it wasn't necessary, but I liked the symmetry of keeping receipts. Meanwhile, I was building my next move, the sale of our old house. The property technically belonged to both of us, but since he was in transit, as his airline called it, I had temporary authority over maintenance decisions. I listed it discreetly, using a shell company through the firm. No one would know until papers were signed. In the middle of that week, a storm rolled in, grey skies, wind pushing the trees like they owed it money. I sat at my desk in the new apartment, laptop open, spreadsheets glowing. For a moment, I almost pitied Greg. Then I remembered Elliot's smirk and the suitcase on our bed. Pity was a luxury I couldn't afford. Around midnight, my phone rang again. This time, I answered. "Vanessa, listen," Greg started, voice uneven. "This has gone too far. You can't just walk away from everything we built." I didn't walk away. I drove away, carefully, after ensuring my lawyer approved the paperwork. "Please," he said, "I'm trying to fix this." "Are you? Or are you just trying to fix your balance sheet?" "I made mistakes." "You made choices," I corrected. "Mistakes are accidents. You had a calendar." There was silence on the line, the kind that stretches long enough to make you aware of your own heartbeat. "I never meant to hurt you," he finally said. "That's what people say when they meant to help themselves," I replied. "Good night, Greg." When I hung up, I stared at the phone for a moment, then turned off the lights. The apartment felt different now, less temporary, more like home. Over the next few days, the consequences rippled through the community. Helen reported that Lydia, the yoga instructor, had been seen leaving Greg's car at the grocery store, red-faced and snapping at him in the parking lot. Looked like quite the argument, Helen told me. People were watching from the produce aisle. Fitting place, I said. He always liked things ripe. She laughed so hard she had to steady herself on the counter. But beneath the humor, I felt a growing calm. Every legal form signed, every account closed was another piece of control returning to my hands. I hadn't realized how light freedom could feel when you finally stopped asking permission for it. By Thursday, Greg showed up at my office. He waited by the reception desk while Kelly whispered, wide-eyed, "Your husband's here." "Ex-husband," I corrected automatically, though the paperwork wasn't final. I stepped out, arms folded. "Greg, what brings you here? Looking for a listing?" He looked tired, older than a week ago. His uniform was wrinkled, hair slightly unkempt. "We need to talk privately." "Fine." I nodded toward the conference room. 5 minutes. Inside, he paced before sitting down. "You took everything, Vanessa. The accounts, the cabin. What am I supposed to do?" "Budgeting might be a good start." "This isn't funny." I wasn't joking. He rubbed his face. "I'm trying to make things right." "You can't make things right with someone who doesn't want your apology." He looked up, frustrated. "You've always been like this, calculating." "Thank you," I said. "That's the nicest thing you've said in years." He slammed his palm on the table. "You think this is justice?" "No," I said calmly. "It's balance. Justice is for courts. Balance is for marriages." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the glass walls, my co-workers pretended not to stare. Kelly's reflection hovered in the window, eyes wide, coffee cup frozen mid-air. Finally, Greg stood. "You'll regret this, Vanessa." "Maybe," I said, gathering my files. "But you'll remember it longer." He left, the door clicking behind him like punctuation. When I returned to my desk, Kelly whispered, "That was intense." "Not really," I said, "just another negotiation." That evening, I sat by my apartment window, city lights flickering below like restless thoughts. My phone buzzed again, another unknown number. I ignored it. Then I received a message from Helen. "You're trending on the community board." Someone posted that Greg's card was declined at dinner with the yoga woman. I couldn't help smiling. "Karma has good taste and timing," I murmured. Later, Leonard called to confirm all transfers had cleared. "You're officially financially independent," he said. "Feels good," I replied, like I finally paid off a mortgage I didn't know I had. The next morning, I found an envelope slid under my apartment door. Inside was a short note in Greg's handwriting. "We could have fixed it. You didn't have to humiliate me." I folded the paper carefully and dropped it into the shredder. Then I made breakfast. By afternoon, the house listing went live under a quiet alias. Within hours, an investor expressed interest. I smiled at the email. Timing, after all, is everything. Around sunset, I received another call. Greg again. I let it go to voicemail. Later, curiosity nudged me to listen. "Vanessa," his voice said, tired and brittle, "I don't know what you want from me anymore." I whispered to the empty room, "Respect," but that ship took off long before I did. As I turned off the light, I realized that silence had become my favorite revenge. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of control. And somewhere across town, Greg was finally learning that the quiet I'd left behind wasn't forgiveness. It was the sound of everything he'd taken for granted disappearing, one signature at a time. By the time the sun came up on Monday, I'd learned something interesting about Maplewood Estates. News didn't travel. It sprinted. By breakfast, the story of my vanished marriage had already turned into a mini-series. I'd become the mysterious heroine who emptied the joint accounts and disappeared into the city. Greg had become the tragic husband who didn't see it coming. The truth, of course, wasn't nearly as cinematic, but I let the myths breathe. They made my job easier. The first sign of the social fallout arrived through my office group chat. Kelly sent me a message. Helen told everyone Greg's girlfriend is the yoga instructor who broke her wrist at that charity race last month. Half the town thinks you cursed her. I laughed so hard I spilled my coffee. Let them, I typed back. Fear is better than sympathy. The new apartment was starting to feel like an extension of myself. Quiet, uncluttered, decisive. I'd swapped the suburban hum of sprinklers and gossip for city noises that sounded like independence. Still, I made the occasional trip back to Maplewood for business. After all, my real estate clients lived there, and pretending everything was fine was part of the job description. That afternoon, I met Helen at the Maplewood Country Club Cafe. She wore oversized sunglasses indoors and looked like she'd been waiting all morning for me to show up. "You caused quite a stir," she said as I sat down. "Greg's been seen with her. The yoga woman. Lydia something." "Lydia," I said, stirring my tea. "Yes, she prefers organic honey and other people's husbands." Helen almost choked on her drink. "You're handling this so gracefully. If it were me, I'd set fire to his golf clubs." "I prefer real fires to symbolic ones," I said. "He's doing a fine job torching his own reputation." Helen leaned in, whispering like we were discussing state secrets. "Apparently Lydia's applying for a small business grant through the town council. Wellness studio expansion. Word is she listed Greg as an investor." That got my attention. "Interesting," I said, "especially since Greg can't withdraw more than $20 without calling the bank first." Helen smirked. "Oh, I adore when karma wears heels." I smiled politely, but my mind was already in motion. If Lydia was building a business, she'd need credibility, and credibility was something Maplewood measured in reputation points. A scandal, even a hint of one, could topple her faster than an unstable yoga pose. That night, I dug into her public profile. Lydia's online presence was pristine. Carefully filtered photos, quotes about positivity, partnerships with fitness brands. But a little digging revealed a string of exaggerated claims. Fabricated certifications, misleading testimonials, and sponsorships that were, shall we say, optimistic interpretations of reality. Nothing illegal, just dishonest. The kind of dishonesty that ruined trust once exposed. I didn't post anything. I simply prepared a file, screenshots, emails, a few pointed observations. Then, I let the gossip engine do the rest. 2 days later, Helen called me. "You're going to love this. Lydia's grant application was withdrawn." "Oh, that's unfortunate." "She's blaming Greg," Helen said. "Apparently, someone sent the council a packet of corrected information about her business. Anonymous, of course." "Ah," I said, "anonymous heroes still exist." Helen laughed. "This town is electric right now. Everyone's whispering about your quiet revenge." "I'm not seeking revenge," I said mildly. "I'm establishing boundaries." The truth was, it did feel like revenge, but not the fiery, reckless kind. It was measured, deliberate, satisfying in its precision. Every rumor, every whisper served as a reminder to Greg and Lydia that I was not the woman they had underestimated. Around midweek, I hosted an open house in one of the newer Maplewood developments. Big windows, marble floors, the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings. As I arranged flowers on the kitchen island, I heard 2 of the visiting wives chatting near the pantry. "She's right there," one whispered. "The realtor?" "Yes, that's her. The one who caught her husband cheating. They say she sold the house out from under him." "No." "Yes, and she's listing his new girlfriend's studio next." I smiled to myself and adjusted the vase. Let them think whatever they wanted. Perception was currency, and right now, mine was skyrocketing. Later that day, Greg showed up at the open house. Of course he did. He had a flair for bad timing. He walked in wearing that half-confident, half-panicked expression of a man who used to own the room but wasn't sure if he still did. "Vanessa," he said quietly. "Greg," I replied, just as calm. "Welcome to the property. Interested in downsizing?" He frowned. "We need to talk. I'm working. This isn't about work." "It always is," I said, leading him toward the back porch where no one could overhear. He took a deep breath. "You're turning people against me." "I don't have to. You do that yourself. You've been spreading things about Lydia." "I haven't said a word about Lydia, but I can't help what the town discovers on its own." "Come on, Vanessa. Don't act like you're innocent." "Innocent?" I laughed softly. "That's not my brand anymore." He looked frustrated. "She's trying to build something good." "So was I said. "Difference is, mine had foundation permits." He looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. The silence between us stretched taut, broken only by the distant chatter of buyers admiring the granite countertops. Finally, he said, "You've changed." "Not really," I said. "You just never looked close enough to notice who I was." He left without another word. As his car pulled out of the driveway, I felt the strange rush of satisfaction that comes when someone finally realizes they can't manipulate you anymore. The next day, Kelly texted me from the office. "Greg just called here, wanted to know if you'd be reasonable. I told him you were showing properties and couldn't be reached by nostalgia." I sent her a virtual thumbs up and a bonus note for her paycheck. Loyalty deserved reward. Meanwhile, Lydia's reputation began to crack. Clients cancelled memberships at her studio, sponsors quietly backed out, and her social media comments filled with subtle jabs disguised as concern. The suburban crowd loved a scandal more than a bake sale, and they devoured hers like dessert. But even victory required maintenance. I kept my actions invisible, always 2 steps removed. I didn't want Greg to know I'd orchestrated any of it. I wanted him to believe the world had simply turned on him, the same way he'd turned on me. Still, not everything went according to plan. Late Friday evening, I got a call from Leonard. "Small hiccup," he said. "Greg tried to move funds from one of your older joint investment accounts." "Let me guess, he couldn't." "He couldn't," Leonard confirmed, "but he's furious. Left a rather colorful voicemail at my office." "Good thing you bill by the hour," I said. Leonard chuckled. "You're enjoying this." "I'm managing it." That weekend, Helen threw her usual Saturday brunch, a monthly ritual disguised as a social event, but really an excuse for everyone to assess each other's marriages. She insisted I come, probably because half the neighborhood would attend, and she wanted front-row seats for the aftermath. I arrived in a navy dress and calm expression. Conversations paused when I entered. You could practically feel the whispers vibrating under the polite smiles. Helen greeted me like royalty. "Everyone, you remember Vanessa, the most composed woman in Maplewood." Someone muttered, "And the richest now." I smiled sweetly, "Only in paperwork." As the morning went on, the tension eased into curiosity. People asked about real estate trends, the market, anything except Greg. But the gossip eventually found its way back, like water slipping through cracks. "So, Lydia's studio," one woman said over mimosas. "I heard it's under review. Something about fake credentials." "Shame," I said, slicing into a piece of quiche. "I'm sure she meant well." The table went silent for a beat before laughter spread around like wildfire. Helen leaned toward me and whispered, "You are terrifyingly good at this." "I'm just fluent in subtlety," I whispered back. By the time brunch ended, I'd managed to reclaim my position in the social hierarchy, not as Greg's wife, but as Vanessa, the woman who played by the rules until she learned to write her own. That night, I returned to my apartment, exhausted but satisfied. I poured a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and reviewed the property listings. Among the messages was one from a buyer interested in the house Greg and I had once shared. The irony was perfect. As I typed my reply, Another message popped up, this one from an unknown number. You've made your point. Stop. No signature again. I set the phone down, smiled, and whispered to myself, if you have to ask me to stop, it means I haven't yet. The following morning, Helen called in a state of breathless excitement. You won't believe this. Greg's trying to sell your old house. He listed it through some discount agent. People are laughing. They say he's desperate. Well, I said, I suppose I'll have to take an interest in the market value of my former home. As I hung up, an idea began to take shape, something bold but perfectly legal. I opened my files, checked the property registry, and smiled when I saw the loophole Leonard had once mentioned. Greg might think he owned the house outright, but a few technicalities said otherwise. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely energized. Revenge wasn't just survival, it was art, and I was about to stage my masterpiece. By evening, I'd made the first few calls, careful and quiet. No one needed to know yet. I simply confirmed one detail after another. Property titles, buyer interest, timelines. Everything aligned perfectly. Outside, the city lights flickered against my window. Somewhere out there, Greg was probably telling himself the worst had passed, but I knew better. He still hadn't learned that silence could be the loudest weapon of all. When I finally closed my laptop, I caught my reflection in the darkened glass. Calm, steady, unrecognizable, from the woman who once waited by the door for him to come home. The neighborhood might have thought they knew the story. They didn't. This was only intermission. The real show hadn't even started. Selling the house Greg thought he still owned was easier than I expected. The paperwork was complex, sure, but people like Greg never bother reading fine print when they believe their charm substitutes for competence. He'd signed every document I'd placed before him years ago, smiling as if signatures were love letters. Now, those same signatures worked for me. I sat in Leonard's office on a humid Tuesday afternoon, reviewing the final clauses. The city skyline shimmered beyond the glass, like it knew a secret. You're certain you want to go through with this? Leonard asked. Once the sale finalizes, there's no going back. That's the point, I said, tapping my pen against the folder. I'm not staging a reconciliation, I'm staging closure. Leonard smiled faintly. He'll find out soon enough. I'm counting on it. The buyer was an investor group planning to rebuild. They didn't care about family history or emotional attachments. They wanted square footage and zoning permits. Perfect buyers. The kind that saw value in demolition and opportunity in ashes. Within 2 weeks, the offer was accepted. A generous one, too. More than we'd ever paid. The funds would transfer directly to me, thanks to an ownership clause that still listed my firm as a managing entity. Legal, precise, and beautifully irreversible. Greg found out the way men like him always do, through gossip. Helen called me before he could. You've caused an earthquake, she announced before I could say hello. Greg just stormed into the bank asking who sold his house. How dramatic, I said, sipping my coffee. Did he use words like betrayal and unfair? Every synonym in the dictionary, she said gleefully. Lydia was with him. She looked like she'd swallowed something unpleasant. I laughed softly. Tell me someone filmed it. Sadly, no, but I painted the picture for everyone at the club. Good woman. When Greg finally called, his voice was a mix of disbelief and restrained anger. You sold our house. I sold my property, I corrected. It just happened to be the same address. You can't do this. I already did. The buyers sign next week. That was our home, Vanessa. It was an address, Greg. Home stopped existing the day you brought your suitcase there for someone else's weekend. He fell silent long enough for me to imagine him clenching his jaw. You think this makes you better than me? No, I said. It just makes me solvent. He hung up without another word. For the next few days, I focused on logistics, closing documents, final inspections, coordinating movers for the furniture I'd stored. I visited the house one last time before the transfer. It stood quiet, sunlit, still smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and wasted time. I walked through each room slowly, tracing the memories like items on a checklist. The kitchen, where we'd argued about everything from grocery lists to vacation plans. The hallway, where he'd once hugged me from behind while I was late for work. The bedroom, where his suitcase had rested that final afternoon, half open, half honest. It didn't hurt anymore. It just felt finished. As I was locking up, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Greg's. Of course. He stepped out wearing his pilot jacket like armor. "So this is it?" he asked. "This is it," I said. "You're actually selling it." "The sale closes tomorrow." He shook his head. "You can't just erase everything." "I'm not erasing. I'm archiving." He took a step closer. "You've changed, Vanessa. You used to be kind. I used to be patient. Different skill set." He sighed, glancing at the house. "Do you even care what happens to it?" "Honestly, I hope they painted a color you'd hate." He laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You really want to ruin me, don't you?" "No, Greg," I said, calm and deliberate. "I just want you to live in a world where you don't get to call the shots." He stepped back, jaw tight. "You're enjoying this?" "I'm documenting it," I replied. He turned abruptly and walked to his car. For a second, I thought that was the end of it. Then he spun back, frustration spilling over. "You think you've won, but you've lost yourself." I smiled faintly. "That's the thing about losing yourself, Greg. Sometimes it's exactly what you need to do to find the right version again." He left in a roar of tires, dust swirling behind him. I watched until the sound faded, then closed the door for the last time. The following morning, the transaction finalized. The investors' team signed, funds cleared, and my lawyer sent confirmation within the hour. Just like that, the chapter of us was legally over. But Maplewood never slept on a scandal. By noon, half the neighborhood knew the house was sold, and speculation bloomed like weeds. Helen called, laughing between words. "People are saying you sold it to a developer planning to build townhouses." Greg's devastated. Lydia apparently called him reckless in the middle of the grocery store. "That's poetic," I said. "He always liked public scenes." Helen lowered her voice. "There's more. Someone scratched the word liar on Greg's car last night. People think it was you." "It wasn't," I said truthfully, "but I'll accept the credit." "I thought so," she said. "You'd have done something smarter, like let him drive on 4 flat tires." "Exactly." Later that day, I drove past the house again, just once. It already looked different, emptier, detached from memory. Greg's car was gone. A for sale pending sign stood proudly in the yard. I couldn't help smiling. Back in the city, I treated myself to dinner at a small restaurant near the river. The waiter recognized me from my real estate ads. "You're the Maplewood agent, right? I saw that big house on Elm Street just sold. Congratulations." "Thank you," I said, lifting my glass. It was a meaningful transaction. When I got home, there was another message from Greg waiting on my voicemail. "You've made your point," he said, "but you can't keep tearing everything apart." I deleted it before he finished. The next morning brought a new kind of quiet, not tense or expectant, just peaceful. I had no calls to avoid, no papers to hide. My world was simple again, and that simplicity felt luxurious. Around midday, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. The autumn air carried that crisp scent of change. As I passed a row of townhouses, I spotted Lydia getting out of her car. She was on the phone, pacing, clearly upset. When she noticed me, her expression froze. "Vanessa," she said, trying for calm. "Lydia," I replied. "How's the wellness business?" Her lips tightened. "You think you've ruined me, but I'll rebuild." "Good," I said. "Rebuilding builds character." "You're cruel," she snapped. "No," I said. "I'm resourceful. There's a difference." She took a step closer. "You don't scare me." "Then you're smarter than your boyfriend," I said. For a moment, she looked like she might say something else, but instead she turned sharply and walked away, muttering into her phone. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of triumph and amusement. She'd chosen the wrong opponent in the wrong town. That evening, Helen invited me over for a glass of wine. She was practically glowing with the latest news. "Did you hear? Greg's been grounded temporarily. Something about a dispute at the airport. Word travels fast when pilots throw tantrums." "How unfortunate," I said, sipping my drink. "I told everyone you had nothing to do with it," she said, grinning. "Though I might have implied you had better things to do than worry about him. You're an excellent press agent." "I try," she said. "So what's next for you?" I smiled, finishing what I started. The truth was, the house was only part one. There were still loose ends, emotional, not financial. People like Greg believed the world forgave charm. I preferred consequences. And I still had one card left to play. A week later, Greg showed up at my apartment building. The doorman called up, warning me that a very insistent man was downstairs. Against my better judgment, I let him up. He arrived looking exhausted, eyes shadowed, tie crooked. "We need to talk," he said. "I don't think we do," I said, crossing my arms. "You've taken everything," he said. "My house, my savings, my reputation." "I didn't take them," I said. "You handed them to me when you stopped treating me like a partner." He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "I never thought you had this in you. That's because you never saw me. You only saw the version that made your life easier. You're not the woman I married." "Good," I said. She was too forgiving. He exhaled slowly, then stepped closer. "What do you want, Vanessa? Tell me what will make this stop." "Nothing," I said. "It already has." He stared at me, realizing I meant it. For a second, he looked like he wanted to argue, then turned and left. After he was gone, I walked to the balcony and watched his car pull into traffic. The city lights reflected on the hood, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger. Just a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I'd rebuilt the rules of my own story. The next morning, Leonard called with a hint of amusement in his voice. "You'll like this," he said. "Your buyers submitted demolition plans. They're turning the property into a modern duplex complex." "Fitting," I said. "Something new rising where something old collapsed." "Symbolic," he added. "Practical," I corrected. When we hung up, I sat back and allowed myself a rare, genuine smile. The house that had once symbolized my marriage would soon be nothing more than foundation rubble. And yet, somehow, I felt lighter knowing it would make space for something entirely new. That evening, Helen sent another message. "Lydia's crying to anyone who'll listen. Greg's car got keyed again. He swears it's you. I told him you're too stylish for petty vandalism." "You're the best," I replied. The sun dipped below the skyline as I stood by the window, watching the colors fade. I didn't need applause or forgiveness. I didn't even need peace. All I needed was to know that Greg and Lydia finally understood what it felt like to underestimate someone who'd stopped playing fair. The house had sold itself, but the real transaction was invisible. The trade of my patience for power, my silence for strategy. And it was the best deal I'd ever closed. Revenge, when it matures, doesn't shout. It whispers in polished tones and wears professional shoes. Mine wore beige heels and carried a real estate folder labeled Wellness Studio Expansion, Client Lydia Gray. It wasn't exactly a lie. Lydia really had called my firm for property advice, too arrogant or too naive to realize who managed the firm's most high-profile listings. I stared at her inquiry email for a full minute before responding. "We'd be happy to assist you. Let's set up a consultation this week." When the day came, Lydia arrived 15 minutes late, wearing athleisure worth more than my first car. Her smile looked expensive and fragile at once. She carried a tablet, a designer tote, and the air of someone who believed reputation could substitute for experience. Vanessa, she said too brightly, this is awkward, right? Only if you make it, I replied, gesturing to the chair. Sit, let's talk expansion. Her confidence wobbled but didn't crumble. I didn't realize you still handled clients personally. I make exceptions, I said, especially for community entrepreneurs. She gave a small, uncertain laugh. You've heard about the wellness project. Everyone has, I said, folding my hands. You're practically a household name now. That made her beam, briefly. We're growing fast. I want to open a second studio in the Heights. More space for retreats, maybe even a cafe. Something modern and mindful. I tilted my head. Mindful, I repeated. Like how you were mindful enough to use Greg's name on your business license application. Her face froze. What? Don't worry, I said smoothly. Public records are very accessible. And before you panic, it's technically not illegal. Just risky, especially if your investors don't like surprises. She shifted in her seat. What are you getting at? I'm getting at due diligence, I said. My firm always verifies clients' background information before any listing. I slid a folder across the desk. This includes certification checks, permit validation, and partnership disclosures. Her fingers hesitated before touching the folder. You went digging. Just routine procedure. I smiled, but I did find some interesting inconsistencies. For instance, your supposed wellness certification expired 3 years ago, and that charity sponsorship you advertised. It doesn't exist. She blinked rapidly. Those are minor errors. Everyone embellishes a little. Some call it embellishment, I said. Others call it fraud, though I'm sure that's not what you meant. Her jaw tightened. You can't prove anything. I don't have to. You already did by signing your name to public filings. She rose abruptly. You're doing this out of spite. I stayed seated, voice steady. I'm doing my job. The rest is just poetic timing. She glared for a moment, then grabbed her bag and left without another word. The echo of her heels trailed behind her, like a bad decision. That evening, the file I'd prepared, the same one with her exaggerated claims and sponsorship fabrications, found its way to 3 places: the Town Business Review Board, a local journalist who covered community affairs, and Helen, who was more efficient than any news agency. Within 48 hours, Lydia's brand began to unravel. The article hit first. Wellness studio faces questions over credentials. The town board followed with an investigation notice. Helen delivered the final blow by circulating the story through every garden club and Pilates circle in Maplewood. By Thursday, Lydia's studio was half empty. Clients cancelled memberships pending clarification. Sponsors withdrew politely worded support. She responded online with a statement about malicious rumours, but denial only fueled the fire. The suburbs loved a scandal served warm. Meanwhile, Greg was unravelling faster than she was. He'd lost his composure first, then his temper, and finally his job. Helen called me with the play-by-play. He got into a shouting match at the airport, she reported, apparently accused a co-worker of sabotage. Management suspended him for misconduct. The union's involved now. Tragic, I said. Maybe he'll find enlightenment at the yoga studio. Helen snorted. Doubt it. Lydia's too busy pretending she's allergic to reporters. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Not because they were suffering, I was past that, but because the balance was finally restored. I had spent years being polite, while Greg walked through life like rules were optional. Now he was discovering that consequences had excellent timing. Still, there was one final piece missing, the confrontation I'd avoided. The one where the air finally cleared, even if only through tension. I didn't plan it. The opportunity presented itself the following week when I learned Lydia was hosting a wellness evening to salvage her reputation. Free sessions, inspirational speeches, and a raffle for mindful living packages. The perfect stage. I arrived uninvited. The event took place in her studio. White walls, calming music, too much lavender oil. She spotted me almost immediately, mid-sentence in front of her small audience. Her voice faltered. "Vanessa," she said from the microphone, tone brittle, "didn't expect to see you here." "I'm curious about personal growth," I said. "You're the expert, right?" A few attendees exchanged glances. Lydia's assistant looked panicked. Lydia forced a smile. "We're here to celebrate resilience. Sometimes people misunderstand success." "Oh, I understand it," I said, "especially the kind built on other people's work." Her jaw tensed. "This isn't the place." "You made every place public when you invited half the town," I said quietly but firmly. The room hushed. Even the ambient spa playlist couldn't fill the silence. Lydia set the microphone down and walked toward me, heels clicking like warning signals. "You've made your point," she whispered. "You ruined my business." "I corrected your paperwork," I said. "You did the rest." She glanced around, realizing the crowd was watching. "If you came here to humiliate me, congratulations. You've succeeded." I smiled faintly. "Oh no, Lydia. I came to return the courtesy." Her eyes flashed. "You're pathetic." "Possibly," I said, "but at least I'm honest about it." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. "You can't scare me." "I don't need to," I said, calm as glass. "You're already scared." And then I did something I hadn't planned. I reached up, brushed her shoulder as if to fix a wrinkle, and whispered, "Next time you take something that isn't yours, make sure you know the terms." Her eyes widened, but before she could respond, I stepped back and, for the first time since Greg's betrayal, allowed myself one small act of physical punctuation. A single sharp slap, not vicious, just enough to slice the air and her pride. The crowd gasped. Lydia's face flushed scarlet. I leaned in and said softly, "That was for pretending you were better at pretending." Then I turned and walked out, leaving murmurs swirling behind me. Outside, the night air felt crisp and clean. I wasn't proud of the slap, exactly. It wasn't elegant, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty demanded sound effects. The next morning, Maplewood was buzzing. Helen called before I'd even poured coffee. "You're a legend," she said. "Half the town saw it. Someone caught the whole thing on video. Lydia's threatening to sue, but her lawyer already dropped her." "Convenient," I said. "She's begging Greg to fix it, but he's apparently out of options. The airline cut him loose officially yesterday." "Unemployment builds character," I said dryly. Helen chuckled. "You always know how to deliver poetic justice." "Not justice," I said, gazing out the window at the sun climbing over the city. "Just accountability." Later that day, Greg showed up at my apartment again. He looked exhausted, wearing jeans instead of his usual uniform, his confidence gone like an old photograph. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Doing what?" I said, setting my coffee down. "Destroying us." "There is no us, Greg. Haven't you noticed?" "You could have walked away quietly." "I did. You followed the noise." He rubbed his temples. "You're not the person I knew." "Then you never knew me," I said. He looked up, eyes tired. "You've ruined Lydia. She's falling apart." "She fell. I didn't push." "You're twisting everything." "Maybe," I said, "but it's about time someone rewrote the story." He stared at me for a moment, as if searching for a trace of the woman he'd once controlled. "You win," he finally said. "It's not a competition," I said. "It's maintenance." He turned toward the door but hesitated. "You could have forgiven me." "I did," I said, "just not in the way you wanted." After he left, I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around me. It wasn't peace exactly. Peace implies something gentle. This was sharper, cleaner. That evening, I received a message from an unknown number, a video clip of Lydia's event, shared widely now. In it, you could hear the gasp, the slap, the murmurs. The caption read, "When Maplewood manners, meet Maplewood justice." I laughed softly and turned off the phone. The video would fade soon enough, replaced by new gossip. But the point had been made. People remembered the woman who refused to play victim. The following week, I returned to my office. Kelly handed me a folder. Offer from an investor interested in that old studio property. They want you to handle the resale. I flipped it open. Figures, I said. Real estate moves faster than remorse. Do you want it? She asked. Of course, I said. Business is business. As I left that evening, the city glowed with the kind of light that makes everything seem possible again. I wasn't naive. I knew this victory wasn't tidy. Revenge rarely is. But it was real, and it was mine. Somewhere across town, Greg and Lydia were nursing their own chaos, discovering what it felt like to lose the illusion of control. And me? I was finally steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to anyone else's choices. I was making my own. And as I drove home, I couldn't help smiling at the thought. Some crashes aren't accidents. They're careful landings disguised as chaos. Revenge, I've learned, has a rhythm. At first it hums quietly, like a song playing in another room. Then it builds, slow, deliberate, unstoppable, until the person it's aimed at finally realizes they're dancing to a tune they didn't choose. By the time Greg and Lydia caught the melody, it was already too loud to ignore. It began with an invitation. Lydia sent glossy flyers across Maplewood announcing her grand relaunch celebration, a desperate attempt to convince the town that her business scandal was a misunderstanding, that her wellness studio wasn't a house of smoke and mirrors. I received my invitation by courier, embossed envelope and all. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. I decided to go, not for spectacle, but for symmetry. I'd started my unraveling the day she smiled across a cafe table at my husband. It seemed only right that hers would begin with me smiling back. The night of the event, I arrived fashionably late, 10 minutes after the speeches started. Lydia stood on a small stage in front of a glowing backdrop that read, "Rise Again, a Journey of Renewal." I almost applauded the unintentional comedy. She wore white, because of course she did, and spoke in that airy, measured tone people use when they want to sound enlightened but are really terrified. "Resilience," she said, hands pressed to her heart. "That's what defines us." I leaned against the back wall, letting her words float over me. She saw me halfway through her speech. The smile on her face flickered like a faulty light switch, but she recovered, voice quivering slightly as she continued. Afterward, I waited until the crowd thinned. She approached cautiously, that influencer smile pasted back on. "Vanessa," she said, "how surprising." I was curious, I replied, keeping my tone light. "You've been quite the talk of the town lately." She tensed. "I'm rebuilding. People love a comeback." "Or a collapse," I said. "Depends on the camera angle." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you want from me?" I tilted my head. "Honestly, nothing. I already have everything I need." Her composure cracked. "You're behind this. The articles, the board inquiry, the cancellations." I raised an eyebrow. "You think I have that kind of power?" "You're lying." "I prefer strategic honesty." I smiled. "But please, go on. It's flattering." She stepped closer. "You ruined my life." "You borrowed my husband," I said evenly. "Let's not argue about ownership rights now." A hush spread nearby as a few guests noticed the tension. Lydia forced a smile, trying to salvage her public image. "I don't have time for your bitterness," she said loudly, pretending to laugh. "That's fine." The morning Greg showed up unannounced, the city was unusually quiet. The air outside my apartment window hung thick with that stillness that comes before something shifts. I just poured my second cup of coffee when the buzzer sounded. One look at the screen told me everything. Greg, standing in the lobby, hands jammed into his jacket pockets, eyes unfocused. He looked smaller than I remembered, though maybe that was just the view from above. I pressed the button and spoke into the intercom. "What is it, Greg?" "Vanessa, I need 5 minutes." "You've had 15 years. I just want to talk." There was a pause, long enough for him to add quietly, Please. That word, fragile and unfamiliar in his mouth, pulled me somewhere between pity and curiosity. Against my better judgment, I buzzed him in. When the elevator opened, he stepped out, looking more like a lost commuter than the man who once made flight crews laugh at his stories. His uniform jacket was gone, replaced with a wrinkled shirt and that particular exhaustion of someone who's been running from consequences. "You look tired," I said, motioning toward the kitchen. "I haven't been sleeping," he admitted. "That tends to happen when people start telling the truth." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "I guess I deserve that." "Deserve has nothing to do with it." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit. Talk." He sat carefully, like the chair might reject him. "You've made your point," he said after a moment. "I lost my job. Lydia's gone. I've got nothing left. I hope that makes you happy." "It doesn't make me anything," I said. "Happiness was never the goal." "Then what was the goal?" "To remind you that choices have consequences." He shook his head slowly. "You always were so good at staying calm while you dismantled people." "Occupational hazard," I said. "Real estate teaches you how to take apart foundations." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Vanessa, I made a mistake. 1. You didn't have to destroy everything." 1? I laughed softly. "Do you even remember how many lies you told to keep your little fairy tale alive? The fake trips, the hotel bills, the fake smiles at dinner when you were already somewhere else in your head." "I wasn't trying to hurt you." "That's the thing about people like you, Greg. You think harm only counts if you meant it." He winced, then looked toward the window as if searching for an escape route. "You got what you wanted," he said finally. "You took everything." "No," I said. "I took what was mine. You just assumed it would always belong to you." For a while neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of city traffic below. Then he stood abruptly, pacing to the other side of the room. "Do you have any idea what people are saying about me? About us?" "I don't follow gossip," I said, though that was only half true. Helen had already filled me in. The outbursts, the humiliation, the neighbors whispering behind manicured hedges. He turned to face me. "They think I'm a joke." "Then they finally caught up," I said. He stared at me, eyes narrowing. "You've become cruel." I met his gaze without flinching. "No, Greg, I've become accurate." He looked away first. I could tell the realization unsettled him, that the woman who once built her world around him was no longer orbiting his gravity. Finally, he exhaled and muttered, "You win." I didn't know we were still keeping score. "You took my house, my career, my reputation." "I didn't take those things. You handed them over when you started lying." "Lydia betrayed me too," he said bitterly. "After everything I did for her. She filed a complaint, says I misled her financially. She's threatening to sue." I raised my brows. "And here I was thinking you two shared everything." "She says she'll go to the press if I don't pay her back." "That sounds exhausting," I said, sipping my coffee. "You should hire a lawyer." He glared at me. "Don't pretend you didn't have something to do with it." "Greg, if I'd done something, you wouldn't have to ask whether I did." That made him pause, and for a moment, there it was again, the flicker of recognition that I was no longer the wife he'd left standing in a half-empty kitchen months ago. He ran a hand through his hair. "What happened to us, Vanessa?" "You happened," I said quietly. And then I adapted. Something shifted behind his eyes. Anger, regret, confusion, maybe all at once. He stepped closer, close enough for me to smell the faint trace of aftershave and cheap hotel soap. "You think this makes you strong, don't you? Watching me lose everything?" "This isn't about strength," I said. "It's about equilibrium." He laughed softly, bitterly. "You sound like a courtroom." "I sound like someone who learned from experience." He looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for a trace of sympathy. Finding none, he sighed and muttered, "You always knew how to make the last word sting." "That's because I never needed to shout it." He turned away, walking toward the door. I thought he'd leave, but instead he stopped and faced me again. "You'll regret this one day." "Maybe," I said, "but not today." He left without another word. For a long while I stood there, listening to the echo of the closing door. Then I walked to the balcony. The city looked clean in the morning light, like a place where people could start over if they had the courage. Below, I saw Greg's car pull away, too fast, the sound of tires against pavement sharp and brief. I didn't watch him go. I just breathed in the air and let the silence settle back into place. A few hours later, my phone rang. It was Helen. "You sitting down?" she asked. "I can be," I said, already smiling. "You won't believe this. Lydia went to the authorities this morning, turned over her business records. Apparently, she claims Greg misrepresented his investments. The man's practically under investigation. It's all over the neighborhood forum." I paused, keeping my voice even. "That's unfortunate." Helen lowered her voice conspiratorially. "People are saying you had something to do with it." "People always say that," I said. "It saves them from having to accept that men like Greg self-destruct just fine on their own." She laughed. "You're a legend. You know that? Half the town wants to hire you as their divorce consultant." "Tell them I'm fully booked," I said. After we hung up, I sat quietly, tracing the rim of my coffee cup with my finger. I hadn't called Lydia. I hadn't needed to. All I'd done was plant the right seeds at the right time and let Maplewood's gossip ecosystem do the gardening. By evening, the story had spread. Lydia had vanished from social media. Greg's employer issued a formal statement about integrity concerns. His name, once synonymous with reliability, now circled the rumor mill like a cautionary tale. And me, I was invisible again, which was exactly how I wanted it. That night, I walked through the city streets, thinking about how strange it felt to finally be free. Not triumphant, not gloating, just free. The kind of freedom that doesn't announce itself with applause, but settles quietly in your bones. I passed a cafe window and caught my reflection. Calm, composed, untouchable. For a moment, I imagined Greg seeing that reflection somewhere, realizing I'd rebuilt myself from the pieces he'd left scattered. When I got home, I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window, watching lights blink across the skyline. Somewhere out there, Greg was facing consequences he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Lydia was probably rehearsing her own story of victimhood, and Maplewood was already turning the scandal into entertainment. I didn't feel sorry for them. Pity was another form of attachment, and I was done being attached. As I stood there, my phone buzzed with a final message from an unknown number. "You got what you wanted." I didn't reply. Some statements don't need answers. Instead, I closed the phone, turned on the stereo, and let the music fill the apartment. The song playing wasn't one I recognized, but it had a rhythm I liked, steady, grounded, quietly powerful. I thought back to everything that had led here, the lies, the gossip, the careful steps I'd taken to turn chaos into order. For a long time, I'd believed revenge was about destruction, but standing there, I realized it was really about reclamation. I'd reclaim my name, my life, my silence. The next morning, the sun hit my window in a way it hadn't in months. Bright, intrusive, honest. I brewed coffee and scrolled through the local paper. There it was, halfway down the business section, pilot suspended amid financial scandal. The article was short, factual, stripped of sympathy, just like the man it described. I set the paper aside and whispered to no one in particular. Escrow finally closed. The words felt good in my mouth, clean, final, earned. Then I finished my coffee, packed my briefcase, and walked out the door into a day that finally belonged entirely to me.